Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. We got a saucy one tonight. It is May 10th, 2023. We're into, I think, week two, feels like 200 of the Alberta election. And we have so much to talk about. We got some silly stuff to talk about, but we also have some more serious stuff to talk about. There will probably be a trigger warning later. Not saying, just saying. To start with, let's clean up some of the news that maybe fell through the cracks, that maybe didn't make it onto people's radar quite so much. One of the first pieces has to do with the Curl oil sand spill. So, for anybody who's not familiar, like a year ago, there was some leaking that happened in one of the tailings ponds up at the Curl site, and it didn't get communicated super great. People simply weren't told. When it was eventually communicated, they're like, it's no big deal. No wildlife's been affected. There's no waterways that have been affected. It's not a big deal. And there were a few First Nations folks up there who said, well, we're not entirely sure. And when they did a tour, they were able to find pictures that demonstrated, in fact, yes, it did get into fish-bearing water bodies, but also it did get to areas where it could potentially impact wildlife. Since that time, scientists have said that tailing pond spills were, in fact, harmful to the fish. Now, Daniel Smith came out a few weeks ago and was like, it's not a big deal. It's all fear. It's all nothing. Nobody needs to worry. Well, the federal government seems to disagree, because on May 4th, it was announced that Environment and Climate Change Canada was opening a formal investigation into Imperial Oil Limited's Curl oil sands site and the associated spill. So now the feds are getting involved because Alberta has done a not great job, maybe, of managing it or expectations. And it's important to really highlight the fact that this is a problem that has been going on for the better part, if not slightly longer, I'd have to check the dates to be sure, than a year. And it is only now that the investigations are kicking in. And part of that has to do with the fact that communications around the spill have been so poor. They have been so incomplete. And the communication, not only from the company to the the regulator, to the government, and then to the people, hasn't been great. And this is particularly problematic because Imperial has come out and owned the fact that the spill was caused by equipment and process failures. So they presumably didn't have the safest processes in place to ensure something like this didn't happen. And they didn't have redundancies or the right equipment to make sure that this didn't happen. And now all of this stuff is reportedly leaking into different waterways and affecting wildlife. And that's a really big problem when you consider the amount of development that's going on and has been going on in northern Alberta for quite some time. Moving on from there, though, because we're going to have a little bit of fun. I did not think when we threw this image up of the no regrets, I didn't think when we threw this up last week that we would be coming back to it this week. But here we are, and you might be wondering why, and it all has to do with this picture that was posted by Danielle Smith just a little while ago when she was doing a tour of some places. Now, it's not so much the picture of the high five that got people's attention. It's more what's on Danielle Smith's arm that got people's attention. Because that's a tattoo. It appears to be, or a badly drawn Sharpie note from somebody in perhaps elementary or junior high school. It got people's curiosity up. What's going on with the funky symbols on Danny's arm? And there was a lot of speculation, and there was a lot of theorizing and conspiracy theories and rena. And what it comes down to is it is actually a glyph. It's a Sumerian word, amagi, and the cuneiform, or the drawing of it, is what Danielle Smith has on her arm. Now, the question becomes, why does Danielle Smith have this on her arm? And that's where a lot of the speculation really kicked in. There were a bunch of people that did different news stories about it. We have one up on the screen right here. Does UCP leader Danielle Smith have a tattoo of a right-wing think tank? And it's yes or no. kind of, sort of, depending on how you choose to interpret it. So we're going to go back to the other graphic for just a sec because it gets to be important. It has been interpreted by a lot of people as meaning freedom. There's a lot of libertarian groups, and this is where it ties into Daniel Smith, who take it as it means freedom. Who doesn't love freedom? Who doesn't love liberty? You gotta love that. Clearly, the Sumerians did, and the Ghostbusters jokes just write themselves for the record. But clearly, the Sumerians did. It means liberty or freedom. Got to be good. The problem is, that's not quite what it means. The literal translation, according to some experts, is that it actually means freedom from debt or the remission of debts, remission from debt, slavery, taxation, or punishment. So it's not so much freedom as in like, I can do what I want. It's more freedom as in, I'm not being oppressed by people who I owe money to anymore. That's what it boils down to. But Smith has very, very clearly gone the more literal, modern interpretation. So from the article that's on the screen right now, the tattoo was done by her stepson, a Calgary tattoo artist. It's an ancient Sumerian cuneiform symbol for liberty or freedom as interpreted by modern day libertarians. Smith recently told the National Post that she learned about the Sumerian word during her days at the Fraser Institute, another libertarian adjacent think tank, having seen the Liberty Fund logo and loved the symbol and its history. So it sounds like Smith was actually introduced to the symbol, the cuneiform, through the Liberty Fund after all. Now, whether or not she decided, I'm going to get it tattooed because, gosh, I just like libertarian think tanks, or she got it tattooed because I like the idea of it meaning freedom, and she didn't go much deeper into the historic meaning. She just liked the initial meaning. Who knows? Article goes on to say, I always thought if I ever had a tattoo, I always thought if I ever had a tattoo, that's what it would be, Smith said. Liberty and freedom has been one of the things I've written an awful lot about. Not to be pedantic, but liberty and freedom are two things. So, there's that. Moving to nominations. Scandal afoot. Some of you might remember back in 2019, there was a significant amount of scandal in Calgary Northeast in the NDP nomination race. One of the candidates who ran for the nomination and one of her scrutineers, associated scrutineers, made a big deal out of the fact that they believed that there was rampant fraud going on in the nomination race. Now, here it's really important to be clear. When we're talking about nominations, we're talking about internal party processes. So it's really the job of the party to decide whether or not they're going to look into it, what kind of investigation they're going to do. But because it's run by internal party rules, that does make things vulnerable. One of the accusations that was leveled in 2019 towards the NDP nomination was that there were people who were going and voting and then going to their local bank saying, I just moved. I need to have this change of address, please. And then they would choose a different address, and then they would go back and they would vote again with a different address. That's one of the allegations that was leveled in 2019. Well, it's 2023, and it seems like the more that things change, the more they stay the same. Except this time, it's not the NDP nomination in Calgary Northeast that's having some scandal associated with it. Allegedly, it's the UCP nomination that's having some scandal associated with it. We were forwarded yesterday. I'd have to check the time to get it right exactly. But anyways, yesterday we were forwarded a report that appears to be the final result of a private investigation that was concluded and conducted in order to see whether or not there was evidence of voter fraud in the UCP nomination in Calgary Northeast. Now, we've said it before, we'll say it again. We're not journalists. We don't claim to be. So we have handed this report off to a couple of trusted, let's say, journalists to let them take a look at it and do their journalism thing with it. But it is a serious piece. Now, one of the reasons why is because it's why we've handed it off. It's not just because we're not journalists, but there's some personal information that's included in this report. To give you a little bit of flavor, though, to give you an idea of what's going on with the report, we're going to share this little tidbit, and this is going to be the only thing that we really have to say about it. Hopefully, the journalists run at it, but this is a heavily redacted piece of the report. The report reads, the writer is confident after speaking with redacted, as well as redacted, that the 4 individuals last name redacted and the other 4 persons with the last name redacted do not and have not resided at either one of these residences, making their membership applications false and a serious breach of the UCP bylaws. I am certain that further scrutiny of the membership applications, including credit card information, will identify and corroborate similar and potential widespread activity. Now, again, that's one of the concluding paragraphs from the report that we were forwarded that appears to have been conducted by a private investigator. From what we read of the report, it seems like the person did their due diligence. But again, as we do, anytime we come across anything major that we don't have the resources or skill set or editorial oversight to try to navigate, we hand it off. So if we hear from any of the journalists that we handed it off to that they're going to be pursuing the story, you better believe we'll be making sure to continue that conversation, because if there are nomination shenanigans going on, and if some of the candidates in the election became candidates through fraudulent means, that's absolutely cause for concern. And especially with everything else that's been going on in the UCP nominations and all of the other scandals in the UCP nominations, it's really important that these sorts of things come to light. And speaking of that, we got to talk about some UCP candidates really quick right here. So this is Eric Lougheed. Eric's had a challenging couple of years, culminating, it seems, in this nomination run that he's got going on, where he's now the UCP candidate for Jason Kenney's old riding, Calgary Lougheed. Some of you might remember from previous shows. Eric is the guy who organized the fundraiser that some people say was the Convoy-themed fundraiser because it had James Bowder, who was one of the organizers of the convoy in Ottawa. He's the guy who is allegedly one of the authors of the Memorandum of Understanding that called for the overthrow of the Trudeau government. He was there with another person who just recently turned themselves into police on multiple warrants connected to the convoy. It was a bit of a to-do. Now, Daniel Smith said of that event, I had no idea that there were people associated with the convoy there, even though there were folks in other pictures who were wearing Truck Trudeau hoodies. There's just no way that anyone could tell that these people who were at an event that they had to show identification allegedly to get into were the people that they were allegedly. Nonetheless, that's not the only scandal that's been going on with Mr. Bouchard. Mr. Bouchard, he had some issues with the lockdowns. He had some concerns with the health measures that were put into place. Jean-Carl Cara tweeted out a little while ago, can't believe it's been 2 years. I'm paraphrasing. Can't believe it's been 2 years since we had to enact a state of emergency. Boy, those were crazy times. 2 years. Wow. Eric Bouchard retweeted that and said, happy anniversary. You sick. F-bomb. Destroying small businesses and people's lives is nothing to celebrate. Maybe time for a career change. Give your head a shake. And then he called him a bodily orifice. Now, where it gets interesting with Mr. Bouchard is he's spun the narrative for quite some time that it's COVID what ruined his business. It was the health measures. He was doing great up until then. COVID ruined everything. And that's why he had a judgment put forward against him for almost $200,000 that he was in default of. So basically, the bank took him to collections to the tune of $200,000. Now, like I said, Mr. Bouchard has made the claims that this is all because of COVID, but there's some reporting that challenges that because back in 2016, Mr. Bouchard was part of a news story where they talked about vacancies in the downtown core. And he talked about the fact that he'd made the decision to move his business to the downtown core. And because of the high rates of vacancy, because business wasn't going great in the downtown core, he wasn't making any money. And he was in trouble because there's no traffic, there's no money. Everybody's left the core. What's a boy to do? So it's fascinating that Mr. Bouchard's problems through documentation appear to have started in 2016, but as soon as he had the COVID scapegoat to blame things on, he was quick to jump on that. But he wants to be the candidate who's going to show up for the people of Calgary Lougheed. He wants to be the guy who's going to stand up, take responsibility. He's going to be the guy who makes sure people know he's there. He's showing up. Unless of court. Oh, sorry. Did I say unless of court? Freud, I guess. Because when it came to that judgment for that almost $200,000 that Mr. Bouchard had defaulted on, he couldn't be bothered to show up for court for his own court case. We received this documentation this week that appears to show that Mr. Bouchard just no-showed on his own judgment with $200,000 of his own money at play. Now, there's been some people who have suggested that should be disqualifying for a UCP candidate. And we've received a couple people who say, hey, in the bylaws, this is very, very bad. This is not somebody who should be pushed through. But as we know, Mr. Bouchard was in fact backed by everybody's favorite right-wing advocacy group, Take Back Alberta. And as we've seen, David Parker makes some pretty overt claims. He kind of owns the Danny Smith. He took out Kenny. He brought Danny into the world of the premiership, and by golly, he can take her out. Maybe there's some leverage going on there. But speaking of other candidates that have some interesting history, let's move on to Chestermere Strathmore. This is Chantelle De Jong or Jong. I'm not sure what you do with the E at the end, so I apologize for that. I'm not trying to make a joke there. I legitimately don't know how to pronounce her last name. She is the nominated candidate for Chestermere Strathmore. And she's got some interesting stuff going on in her background as well that might give some people pause. You might remember very early on in the UCP's tenure as government, one of the things that happened is one of the Northern Alberta MLAs, and I'm not making fun of Northern Alberta because that's where I'm from, Dandy Williams, he got up and he said, hey, I'm going to introduce this bill about conscious rights. And then he said, oh, no, I meant to say conscience rights. I think people should have a right to be conscious too, but I'm no lawyer, nor am I an MLA. But Dandy Williams introduced a bill on conscience rights. Conscience rights, for anyone who's not familiar, is the idea that if a physician or a healthcare provider or anybody who's providing service to anyone else feels that it goes against their conscience to provide services for someone, even if they're healthcare services, it goes against their conscience to provide services for that person, they should be able to say no. Now, what this is particularly targeted to is if somebody goes to see a physician and says, hey, I'm in a bit of a spot. I've made a decision. I need to have an abortion. How do I do that? If you were to go see a doctor who was anti-abortion and who wanted to exercise their conscience rights under Dan Williams' proposed legislation, then the doctor would be able to say, I don't believe in that. I'm not going to help you. Similarly, if a doctor was approached by a patient who was LGBTQ2S plus and was asked for health care relevant to that, or if they were just asking for health care, then a physician who believed being LGBTQ2S plus is a choice could say, your lifestyle goes against my conscience, so I'm not going to treat you. Gets to be really problematic really, really quickly. Particularly when we're talking about areas of Alberta that are more rural, where maybe if you're lucky and you have a doc in your community, you don't know where that doc lies on the ideological spectrum. Now, right now, the physician or the healthcare provider at least has to provide a referral. So if I'm a doctor and I decide, I really don't want to do abortions, I don't like abortions, I'm not going to be an abortion doctor, that's cool. Nobody's forcing you to do abortions, but you do have to say, but I do know this guy who does do the things. here you go call Dr. Timmy, for lack of a more creative name. That is the rule right now. Nobody's being forced to provide medical procedures that go against their beliefs. They're just being forced to provide a pathway for people who need it. The conscience rights would allow physicians to, for whatever reason, say, hard nope, I'm not even going to have this conversation. Why does this get to be relevant with Chantel? Well, Chantel's got some stuff going on. When she first launched her nomination campaign, she had a big town hall. It wasn't a little town hall, it was a big one. It's right there in the title, about reclaiming Alberta's future, because apparently somebody took it. I didn't know that, but that's the claim here. And Chantel had her big town hall. Who's the keynote speaker? Renowned, angriest Caillou ever. From the counter signal, Mr. Justin Trudeau's creating environmental police to come and take you if you don't believe in climate change. Obviously, that's bullshit. Cian Bexty. You know what? It's Cian Bexty, so I'm going to say it's Chantelle De Jong because that's more fun. But that's not the only stuff. I mean, the affiliation with Angry Caillou is a little bit of a cause for a raised eyebrow, for sure. But, you know, people have friends. You can't judge people for having friends. Unless, of course, your friends are an organization that is pushing you out to all of their membership because you're a pro-life candidate. If that organization is a national organization and is saying, hey, this pro-life candidate needs your help. This is an email that went out during Chantelle De Jong's nomination. Chantelle De Jong is a young pro-life candidate who values family and believes that this is the foundation of a strong community. She has a bachelor's degree with distinction in economics and philosophy from the University of Calgary and previously worked as a dental assistant as a federal conservative and with a federal conservative member of parliament. Chantel believes in strong conservative principles such as religious freedom and parental choice in education, respecting the hard-earned tax dollars of Albertans and ensuring they get the best value for those tax dollars. She also believes that we need a new voice who is willing to work hard and provide true principled conservative representation. Who's the organization that sent that email out, you ask? Well, gosh, I'm glad you asked. It's an organization called It Starts Here. Sorry, It Starts Right Now. It Starts Right Now is a nationwide organization that's whole job is to elect pro-life candidates across the country to make Canada a safer place. Denying women access to healthcare, it makes things safer, don't you know? A safer place for women and children. This is the organization that was organizing and rallying support for Chantelle De Jong, because she is ostensibly a pro-life, anti-abortion, anti-access to women's health care, I'm going to call it like it is, candidate. So that's not great. And that brings us to our first little section of videos, because we're going to play some videos for those of you that are listening on the Twitter Spaces. Don't worry, we will open it up to commentary in a little bit. But tonight we're gonna play some videos because there have been some pretty prominent videos that have been making the rounds, depending on who you ask, either for the last 8 hours or 6 days. Just gonna take a sip of my drink there. No reason. We're going to start with a series of videos that were recorded where Danielle Smith was speaking at something called Freedom Talk on October 23rd, 2021. Other speakers included Andrew Lawton from True North, because you can't throw a rock 20 feet from Danielle Smith without hitting somebody who's affiliated with True North, Paul Hinman, Maxine Bernier, and of course, John Carpe. Now, where this gets to be particularly important is because Danielle Smith went to this conference, Wish.com version of a TED Talk, to explain her beliefs on her vision of how healthcare should look in the province of Alberta.
What needs to occur is that any hospital needs to be able to contract directly so that they can get their funds directly and get outside of this structure that we have where it's sort of trickle down, whatever finally makes it to the front line, whatever decisions will finally allow you to have, will let you have. We already have a mechanism to set up private surgical centers. So imagine if High River Hospital, which does most of the hernia operations, by the way, in Southern Alberta, what if they said, you know what, we don't need to be under the umbrella of Alberta Health Services. We'd like to charter directly with Alberta Health Insurance and get our money directly. And you give a global budget to pay for what you would expect the emergency room to be on a traditional basis, but then they get paid based on activity. If they're able to do 1,000 hernias, they get paid on a per patient treatment for 1,000 hernias. If they're able to change their operations so they can do 2,000 hernia operations, then you allow the funding to follow through. None of these things would be outside the realm of what is currently possible under the Canada Health Act. You give money to Alberta Health Insurance. It's a separate entity. It's a government entity, so it's publicly administered. They are forbidden from running any programs or any hospitals themselves. Alberta Health Services becomes the contractor. Sure, we can grandfather in their contracts for now, but then we would have the Alberta Health Quality Council do us an auditor function and tell us whether or not Alberta Health Services should continue running the Lougheed Hospital or the Rocky View Hospital or South Campus or any of the 100 hospitals that they currently run in majority in the province. And if they can't meet the terms that we want them to, we can do an RFP. And then the Alberta Health Insurance can give a different contract to a different group of doctors and a different group of patients and a different entity to run all of our hospitals. That is completely compliant with the Canada Health Act. It's a structure issue and it's a political will issue. And we've got neither of those, unfortunately, because I presented this to the health minister and they did not act on it.
Now, there's a lot to unpack in that 2.5 minutes of ideas, let's call it. Let's start with the argument that, you know what, AHS is it's too big, it's too unwieldy. It takes so long for these ideas to trickle down through all the different hospitals. What we really need to do is, instead of having one administration that's responsible for all of the finance and administration and ordering and supply management and policies and what we need to do is duplicate that at the level of every single hospital, which is, for somebody who's arguing that we need to cut down on management and management roles, a fascinating approach to take. But she's very, very clear in there where she talks about the fact that, you know, if we have all of these separate contracts going on, sure, we'll let AHS be a part of it for now, but, you know, maybe down the road, who knows? So she's very, very clearly building towards an end goal in that conversation. But that's not the only end goal that she was talking about, because she also talked about the infamous health spending accounts.
System comprehensive now? Of course it isn't. It pays for hospital services and it pays for doctor services, and pretty well everything else can be paid for under a health spending account. That is the way that we can absolutely transform the way our healthcare system works. And it would only cost $1.5 billion. So here's the plan. Just establish a health spending account with $350 for every single Albertan and tell them your employer can match it. You can match it. You can put money in tax-free. You can gift it to a friend or family member. If you don't need it, you want to set up a charity because you know that there are others who need more serious care, you can contribute it to, you can transfer it between different accounts. It would only cost $1.5 billion. And I guarantee you, it would absolutely change the relationship between the doctor and the patient. It would restore that relationship and would take the college out as the intermediary, take Alberta Health Services out as the intermediary. And we would see a proliferation of the kind of clinics that I was talking about and the kind of telehealth services and the kind of surgical services I was talking about just a minute ago. You need to give people the means to spend their own money on these types of services. Otherwise, and we've seen it, otherwise people will just sit and they'll wait.
Now, it's important to take into context what kind of clinics that Danielle Smith was talking about, because she wasn't talking about a visit to your doctor's office. What she was talking about was an organization that does almost entirely naturopathic and homeopathic and woo medicine, which is to say, not real medicine. because medicine that's been proven to work isn't called alternative medicine. It's just called medicine. So there's that little bit about it. But it got even more, let's go with antagonistic, because Danielle Smith had some very, very strong words that she wanted to direct towards physicians.
I don't think that there's something seriously broken with the medical research system. I think that COVID has revealed that. Then you look at treatment, and with the exception of the doctors in this room, I have found doctors to be astonishingly uncurious about what is available out there. Isn't it the truth? Astonishingly uncurious. This is the other part of it, is that there does seem to be, and maybe the doctors will have to explain this, that maybe doctors cram so much information in their brain in medical school they didn't feel like they had to learn anything else. Maybe they've just deferred too much to their college to tell them what's on and what's off. But the doctors that I know have researched this independently know that there are a lot of drugs that have the potential, not just the two that the media have freaked out about, but budesonide and fluvoxamine and colchicine. There's a whole list of them. I'm reluctant really to even talk too much about them, because that'll be the next thing that causes a furor and gets demonized as a horse pill. But that isn't proper medicine. It's not proper medical research. It's bad politics. And it's also, I think, a dereliction on the part of the media to be covering it the way they have. The colleges as well, not only are they incurious, they're full of bullies. And to me, the attitude that they have taken towards doctors, that they would rather patients have nothing for treatment than dare to have a doctor do something different than the majority is recommending, that is a clear sign.
So a lot going on there at that little bit. The doctors are just uncurious. That's what the problem is. Physicians never partake in any sort of studies. They certainly don't organize any sort of studies in regards to pushing the advances of medicine. The problem here is that Danielle Smith thinks she knows about medicine. She thinks she knows about these alternative treatments and these proposed drugs that some doctors, let's just say, there's good doctors in the world, there's great doctors in the world, there's mediocre doctors in the world, and then there's other doctors. So let's just say that these other doctors have proposed some of these treatments. Danielle Smith thinks that these treatments would be a good idea. Danielle Smith thinks that she knows so much about medicine that she's in a position that she can question physicians, she can question the College of Physicians and Surgeons, because she knows so much. If Danielle Smith knew even a fraction of what she claims she knows about these medicines, she'd know how to pronounce them, and she'd know it's not colchicine, it's colchicine, and it's used for gout. Danielle Smith is a perfect example of what happens when somebody gets a hold of just enough information to be profoundly, profoundly dangerous. And speaking of that, speaking of being profoundly, profoundly dangerous, there is an incredibly dangerous situation that has been evolving in Alberta. I'm, of course, talking about the wildfires. Now, natural disasters, extreme weather events, are a product of the environment. And almost all of the experts have been saying for years, whether we're talking about the hailstorms that we saw in Calgary, whether we're talking about the floods, whether we've been seeing more and more extreme weather events, and that is directly attributable to climate change. I'm sure the comments on the Facebook are going to go nuts right now. You all can go ahead and type your things. We've got a moderator on. But the reality is we're only going to see more and more extreme weather events. And this is where leadership gets to be so important. And this is where if somebody wants to put themselves in a position of leadership, they should be behaving as such. But unfortunately, what we've seen from Team UCP has rather tragically been the complete opposite of that. We saw this come out from journalist Safe Kaiser Drayton Valley, Devon, UCP candidate Andrew Boychenko's household was visited by officials after disregarding a fire ban on May 3rd. A fine was issued. UCP says Boychenko wasn't the one who lit the fire, but someone else in his house did. The statement from the party on May 3rd, after learning about the seriousness of area wildfires and prior to any evacuation orders. So if there's a fire ban, you don't actually have to listen to it, is the logic. It's only if there's an evacuation order. It's only when the situation has got completely out of hand that we need to take any sort of measures, appears to be the official argument from the UCP. But okay. A family member at the Boychenko home used a fire pit in their backyard. The fire was contained and did not spread. And family member deeply regrets their mistake. Mr. Boychenko did not violate any municipal bylaws, nor was he present when the incident occurred. But you would think, when we're talking about people who might know about the dangers of fire and the importance of following advisories, a family that had lost their house in a fire would be at the top of the list. Apparently not. Back in 2020, and there's some questions around the reportedly and the allegedly going on in this article. Those reportedly words are doing a lot of heavy lifting in this article. There was a house fire that was started, and the family lost their house, and tragically, they lost their dog as well. We're not going to make any jokes about the dog, but it's really, really sad. That's a family that lost their house to a fire not 3 years ago. Didn't take the warnings saying, hey, there's a fire ban because there's fires that are out of control. They apparently didn't take that too seriously. But where it gets really reckless, where it gets really irresponsible, we got to go back to the folks that Take Back Alberta. Marco Van Hugenbos, who is one of the alleged convoy organizers. He does still have his court date pending. And he's also one of the key organizers for Take Back Alberta. Also one of the key organizers for Chelsea Petrovich and Livingstone MacLeod. Also a counselor. This is what he had to say. I'll say the quiet part out loud. What's happening in northern Alberta is nothing short of sabotage. This is the work of sinister operatives looking to create panic, fear, and anger. Stay vigilant, people. It is unbelievable that anyone who considers themselves to be in any kind of a position of leadership would, without any evidence, speculate that all of the fires that we're seeing are the result of a deliberate, coordinated sabotage attack on the province of Alberta. And yet, here's Mr. Hugenmoose doing exactly that. Moving on from there, we got one more clip that we forgot to play about the Danielle Smith health conversation that she had. And this is where it really shows that Danielle Smith has no grasp of medicine. Take a listen.
Who gets diagnosed, we are going to give them an early treatment care package in the mail so they have something, whether it's steroids or anti-inflammatories or blood thinners, so that they can feel some confidence that in that viral replication stage in the first 7 days, that they can minimize their chance of being hospitalized.
Now that's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. The notion that you're going to send blood thinners to people through the mail without consequence is absolutely over the top, reckless, and dangerous. For anybody who's not familiar, when you use blood thinners, there are a boatload of risks that are associated with it. Because if you drop your clotting factor too low, you can literally bleed to death. It's something that typically, with most blood thinners, needs to be aggressively monitored. So the notion that we could just say, hey, you've been diagnosed with COVID, therefore, we're going to just send you a bunch of meds. You haven't been assessed by a physician. You've done presumably a rapid test. We'll just send that and hope for the best. What could possibly go wrong? It's absolutely mind-boggling that Danielle Smith would think that that is an accessible and reasonable route to take. But nonetheless, there she was. Moving on from there, we got to talk about the tragic events that are unfolding across the province of Alberta right now. And yeah, we are talking about the wildfires because there are wildfires that are going across the province at a rate that we have never seen before. And it's really scary and it's really problematic. We are seeing evacuations across the province. And this is one of those places and times where leadership gets to be so critically important. But we have seen some major scandals unfold in regards to this over the last little while. And we're going to take a sec to try to talk about some of those. To start with, on May 4th, Danielle Smith had a press conference at noon. Actually, no, before we go to that, we're going to talk about the firefighters first. Because one of the things that the UCP government did early on in their tenure was they cut a firefighting program. Now, when they cut that firefighting program was an elite group of firefighters who were trained explicitly to deal with wildfires, and they're trained to rappel out of helicopters to get to hotspots and to get to areas that are otherwise inaccessible. They're an extremely important program, and the UCP said, you know what? They don't need to rappel. We're gonna cut the funding for that program, which was incredibly reckless and incredibly unnecessary. And it kind of sets the stage for how this disaster has been dealt with so far. Let's go now to Saturday, May 6th. Danielle Smith held a press conference where she talked about the fact that the wildfires were going on and they were really bad and that we should probably do some things about them. There was going to be cabinet meetings, there was going to be briefings, there was going to be all of the things. It was going to be big conversations, and that was the crux of the press conference. Press conference ended, and then what happened? Danielle Smith went from that press conference to a private fundraiser. Now, this was an expensive fundraiser. Reportedly, it was $400 a ticket. Do with that what you will. But a very expensive fundraiser. And at this fundraiser, she told the group of UCP supporters, who, by the way, allegedly included Tariq Khan. This will get to be important later because Tariq Khan, some of you might remember, is the same guy who resigned, from the Premier's Council on Immigration, Inclusion and Multiculturalism, after it was discovered that he had actually been disqualified from the UCP in 2019 because he has a history of posting anti-Semitic, Holocaust denial posts on social media. So for reasons that defy understanding, apparently Tariq Khan was also at this event. And at this event in Calgary, where the wildfires aren't affecting people at that time. As of this, they're not affecting people other than Calgary's doing a great job of taking some people in who are being evacuated. But there's no wildfires in Calgary right now. There's no evacuation where people are having to leave Calgary right now. That was happening in other parts of the province where Danielle Smith wasn't. But for reasons that defy any kind of logic, it was at this event that Danielle Smith decided to give the inside track to the people who had donated all of this money that she was going to be declaring a state of emergency. Now, not only is this really problematic because it's profoundly disrespectful to the people who had to evacuate up until that point, who were being affected directly by the wildfires, who had lost their homes, their businesses to the wildfires. That's not who Danielle Smith told first. No, she told this group of UCP insiders first. But there's a bigger problem with that. It has been pointed out that by doing so, Danielle Smith breached her oath of cabinet confidence. There are very strict rules about how information that's discussed in cabinet can be shared. Because if that information is shared improperly, it can cause some really big problems. Nonetheless, Danielle Smith decided she didn't have to worry about that oath. She decided that she was going to go ahead and share her super fun big news anyways, for no reason other than that's what she wanted to do. She wanted to feel like she was telling the cool kids a cool kids story. And she's been getting in quite a bit of hot water since then. But that's not the only problems that have been going on. Because we got to talk about this. There were 2 videos that were posted on Sunday. So this is the day after all of that controversy. There were 2 videos that were posted on Sunday from, again, this Twitter account. Whoever runs it, I need to buy them like a carafe of coffee, because they are doing such a public service in making sure that horrifying things that Danielle Smith has said come to light. And we got to be really clear about this for a second. When we're talking about the dumb shit that Danielle Smith has said, we're not talking about conversations where she was with friends and, y'all say things with friends that you would never say in front of a microphone. She was saying these in front of a microphone. She was saying these things knowing that she was being recorded and being broadcast across the internet. There's no surprises here for Danielle Smith. There were 2 clips. Now, one of the clips has gotten a lot more attention than the other one. So we're going to do the first one first, and then we'll talk about the one that's gotten all of the attention.
All about early treatment. And so that's what I started this GoFundMe lawsuit about. We ended up raising $100,000 very quickly. The challenge has been, the issue is the colleges. And the college is the one that I believe is operating outside their mandate. They are mandated through legislation to give doctors wide latitude to use their expert judgment to treat their patients, as long as they have considered the potential for drug interactions. They're not overdosing. They're not giving them something that's inappropriate, or there's obviously, you want to make sure there's no obvious sign of malpractice, but other than that, they're supposed to be able to be given a wide berth in trying what they think is going to work. And I believe that the colleges have.
I think that's what they call the practice of medicine.
Isn't it? Definitely. So just because something is not accepted by the mainstream, we don't do science by vote, right? We do science by experimentation, observation. If something works, we do more of it. If it doesn't work, we try something else. That's the scientific process, the scientific method. The problem, and I hope we never do this again, the problem with putting doctors in charge is they seem to be hardwired against criticism. They seem to have a medical profession that is almost like a military command structure, that the person at the top cannot be argued with, cannot be contradicted, otherwise it's some crime that's worthy of punishment. And if that's the way the medical profession operates, then I don't think we can have them in charge again in a future pandemic. It's got to be something more like a military chain of command, actually. A military chain of command, yeah, there's a top guy, but they give a lot of latitude to people in the field to make their own judgment, because you have to. You can't micromanage every decision from the top when you're in a combat theater. And so I think that I think our military is actually better trained to understand the balance between chain of command and frontline decision making. They're certainly better trained in understanding our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that there are limits to what you can do to people.
Now, I need to be clear, because I'm going to go off for a little bit here. I am not, nor have I ever been, a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. I do not pretend to speak for anybody other than myself. I have some anecdotal experience with people who have served. I have some very close friends who have served. I have family that has served. I've done a lot of reading. That's what I'm basing the next, let's hope for 15 minutes on. But that video clip demonstrates that Danielle Smith doesn't have a good goddamn clue how things work in the military. The notion that people operating in a military theater can just choose to do what they're going to do betrays a stunning ignorance for how things actually work. And there's plenty of real world examples that I can draw from here. One need only look at the book that was written by Romeo Dallaire, who was a high-ranking military person involved in military operations under a military command structure in Rwanda. And he had to deal with having his hands tied by the military command structure. He details in that book the many ways and the incredible amount of trauma that was visited upon him and the people under his command because there's this little thing called rules of engagement. Clearly, a term that Danielle Smith, on many levels, literal and metaphorical, has never heard of. But members of the military are incredibly constrained in regards to how they can act, when they can act, all of the things. And for Danielle Smith to make the argument that the military are better equipped to disregard orders when so much of the training that goes into being a member of the military is following orders is stunningly ignorant. The notion that the military is better equipped to handle the complexities of a health crisis is unbelievably ignorant. Since that clip has aired, we have gotten no shortage of DMs from people who have been and still are involved in the military. And universally, the commentary has been, if you want to see things go really, really badly, really, really quickly, try doing what she suggests there. It's absolutely ludicrous. It's profoundly disrespectful to physicians. And the notion that, again, doctors are somehow uncurious and that they're tied to a strict command structure is absolutely laughable. Physicians and medical practitioners follow protocols. They follow standardly accepted practices for sure, because that's what evidence-based medicine is. You don't get to do a trial on a patient just because it's Tuesday. There are strict methods to make sure that those trials produce reliable results. And one of the biggest problems that we've seen coming out of this pandemic is people like Danielle Smith are reading garbage papers written by garbage practitioners. And they're taking it as gospel when the bodies that exist to protect people from that garbage are saying, no, that's not great. But rather than give these bodies and these healthcare professionals and these physicians who got us through the pandemic thus far, she wants to denigrate them and speak about them like they don't care about their patients. They care about being elite. It's absolute garbage. But of course, as we know, that was just the tip of the iceberg.
Notice you're not wearing a poppy, I'm not wearing a poppy, but they ruined it for me this year. The political leaders standing on their soapbox, pretending that they care about all the things that you just talked about, pretending they understand the sacrifice, and not understanding that their actions are exactly the actions that our brave men and women in uniform are fighting against. I don't know if you've had a chance to watch the Netflix series, How to Become a Tyrant, but it starts with Hitler in the first episode, and it's absolutely appalling and shocking.
Yeah.
How and it's one academic says, I know so many people would say, and they must have filmed this before COVID, so many people say that they would not have succumbed to the charms of a tyrant, somebody telling them that they have all the answers. And he said, I guarantee you would. And that's the test here, is we've seen it. We have 75% of the public who say, not only hit me, but hit me harder, and keep me away from those dirty unvaxxed. And even on the cover of the Toronto Star, saying, I want people who are unvaxxed to get sick and die, and I don't even care. I don't want them to get treatment. We're already hearing about people being denied treatment for not being vaccinated, being taken off the organ donor list. What are we becoming? What are
That's
we becoming?
vile. That's vile and diabolical. Sorry.
It is diabolical.
It is that rhetoric that has caused so many problems. Now, first of all, it has been made clear by organizations who have way more moral authority than I do that what Danielle Smith said about the poppies was reprehensible. The Canadian Legion came out and issued a statement because of what Danielle Smith said. The poppy is a symbol of remembrance for those who have served Canada and made the supreme sacrifice in the name of democracy. It has no role in politics. The sacrifices made by those whom the poppy represents have safeguarded the rights and freedoms that Canadians enjoy today. But it wasn't just the Legion who came out. The Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center came out and said that this 2021 video showing the current Premier of Alberta comparing vaccinated Canadians to supporters of the Nazi regime is incredibly disconcerting. While an apology has been made, and let's be clear, it was really half-ass apologies. She apologized for offensive language. She didn't apologize for the ideas that she put forward. It doesn't fix the harm caused. That last little bit was editorializing on my part. Holocaust comparisons are inappropriate, disrespectful to the victims, and minimize one of the darkest times in human history, which the Jewish community has been outspoken about since the start of the pandemic. And then they tagged Danielle Smith. Now, you might be wondering, who are the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center? Who was Simon Wiesenthal? He was a survivor of the Holocaust. But not only did he survive, he spent the rest of his life tracking down Nazi war criminals who had participated in the Holocaust and making sure that they got the justice that they deserved. This is the organization that's calling out Danielle Smith's use of that language. And I can't help, before I drop this and move on to my point, I can't help but bring the reality that this is not the first time that we have seen Danielle Smith or the UCP talk about the Holocaust inappropriately. The UCP disqualified Nadine Wellwood in Livingstone McLeod because she equated vaccine rules, just like Danielle Smith did just there, to the Nazi regime. As I mentioned earlier, we saw Tariq Khan, who has a history of posting anti-Semitic, Holocaust denial stuff on Facebook. It's why the UCP disqualified him as a candidate in 2019. He resigned from his role with Danielle Smith's Inclusion and Multiculturalism Council. And Danielle Smith somehow thinks, the communications people for Danielle Smith somehow think, the executive of the UCP somehow think that issuing an apology, apologizing, again, not for the content, but the choice of words is acceptable, is quite frankly beneath everybody involved in this equation. Now, it's worth noting, Danielle Smith was called out because of her comments. Her comments put her in the exact same space as Nadine Wellwood, who was disqualified. And at a press conference, she was asked about exactly that.
Hi, for the Premier. Shortly after you were elected UCP leader, the UCP board disqualified Livingstone McLeod candidate Nadine Wellwood, who had made some social media posts comparing public health measures to oppressive Nazi Germany policies, and we've now heard comments that you made in 2021, where you compare Albertans who took COVID-19 vaccine as supporters of Adolf Hitler. So I'm wondering, is the standard set with your party's handling of Nadine Wellwood one which should apply to yourself, and if not, why?
Look, COVID was a really difficult and frustrating time for everyone, including me. And I don't think that there is a single one of us that wasn't deeply impacted in some way. Sometimes I let my frustrations get to me during that time. I clearly shouldn't have. But when I got elected, I vowed to put those dark days behind all of us. It's part of the reason why a few weeks ago, when I went to a Red Deer prayer breakfast, one of the things they asked when they were saying that, what do you want us to pray for? I said, you know what, let's just pray for every Albertan, that each of us can get over the trauma of the last 3 years in our own way. Every single Albertan was hurt over that period of time. And it's why I vowed when I got elected that we were going to put it in the past, that we were going to look forward, that we were going to make sure that this was a place where everybody from every walk of life felt valued and respected and optimistic about the future. And that is what I'm going to continue to do.
That statement alone should be disqualifying. It should be disqualifying not only for public office, but it should certainly be disqualifying for the office of the premier. First of all, it's a lie. For Danielle Smith to claim that when she became leader of the UCP and premier of Alberta, she decided that she was going to leave it all behind, she was going to get Albertans to move on, is absolute garbage, because she also made the promise during her leadership campaign and immediately after she took office as premier that she was going to introduce vaccination status as a protected human right. Now, she's since said, just kidding, it turns out I can't do that, but that's the promise that she made to get her in office, and that's the promise that she made when she got into office. Now, I can imagine there's a whole list of reasons why Danielle Smith would love nothing more than to pray away the history of everything that she said, but it's simply not good enough for somebody who wants to be the premier of Alberta. The admission that she got frustrated and lost control is totally disqualifying for somebody who wants to be in the highest position of leadership in the province of Alberta. I don't know about the people who are listening to this right now, but I don't recall at any time during the pandemic where I looked at the gift of vaccines and said, this is just like that thing. The vast majority of Albertans, 75% by Danielle Smith's own numbers, embraced the vaccines. They did the right thing. And for Danielle Smith to vilify them after the fact, and repeatedly no less, and then to claim, I was just really having a bad day, guys. That is not the sort of temperament that you want from somebody who's running the province, who's setting the course for the economic and social future for the province of Alberta. If she can get so knocked off kilter that she's willing to start throwing around Nazi and Holocaust comparisons at a time when the rest of Alberta, 75% at least, again, by her own numbers, were pulling together and trying to take care of each other, that should absolutely be disqualifying for her. And I'm not even done yet, because here's the part of the clip that I find particularly, the whole thing's offensive. You can't measure and go, there's this part that was more offensive, but there's one piece that hasn't really been touched on, and it's this piece right here.
Notice you're not wearing a poppy, I'm not wearing a poppy, but they ruined it for me this year.
They ruined it for me this year. I don't even know where to start with this. I have notes. I made notes because I knew I was going to get all kinds of angry on this one. But for Danielle Smith to claim that Remembrance Day and observing Remembrance Day was ruined for her shows a complete lack of understanding of what Remembrance Day is actually supposed to be about. She goes on in that clip to talk about the Nazis, which not only shows that she doesn't have a basic understanding of what Remembrance Day is about, she doesn't have a basic understanding of Canadian history. Remembrance Day didn't come from World War II, Danny. It came from World War I. And you have to know the history of World War I to understand the tone and the significance of what Remembrance Day is supposed to mean. And why it's not, when we put on poppies, it's not about us. It's about us acknowledging and learning from our history, which Danielle Smith clearly has zero understanding of, because Canada didn't get drawn into World War I because of the kind of, I don't know, vaccine bullshit that she's talking about here. World War I, from a very high level historical standpoint, happened because Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. That caused two countries to decide that they were going to mess each other up. But those two countries had treaties with two different treaty organizations. One of them was Russia, France, and Britain. The other one was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and I forget the third country. It's probably in there. Somebody can look it up and give me shit, but I'm pretty wound up right now, so bear with me. Germany decided that they were going to back the folks that they did. And because of that, they knew that they were going to get into a war with Russia and France both. They crossed their fingers, hoped for the best, attacked France first, thinking that it would be the easier opponent to beat. As soon as they did that, that drew Britain and the United Kingdom in. World War I was a war of treaties. One of the lessons historians and people who got through that war, who wrote about it, and for those of us who were able to hear some stories talked about, was that it's not about, I mean, Remembrance Day is a lot of different things. I want to be clear. I'm not trying to oversimplify things. And if I get something wrong in this, I'm not going to try to issue some sort of bullshit blanket apology. If I get something wrong, by all means, you know where to find me. But one of the biggest things that Remembrance Day is supposed to be about, and I was told this by somebody who fought in both World War I and World War II on the front lines, is that when you send young men and women now off to war, you are asking them to participate in some of the worst things that human beings have the ability to do to each other. You are asking them to visit that on other people that they don't know, and you are asking them to be willing to accept that same fate themselves. The phrase, "lest we forget," exists to say, don't ever let this happen again for dumb reasons. Understand, when you get involved in a military conflict, the cost is more horrific than you can imagine. I don't claim to know from firsthand experience what that cost is, because I don't. But I have been fortunate enough to hear the stories from people who were there. I have been fortunate enough to see how much it has affected them. And I'm not just talking about World War I, and I'm not just talking about World War II. I have friends who have been involved in conflicts recently, and the scars, emotional, psychological, and physical, that they carry with them are very, very real. What Remembrance Day at its core is asking us to do is to learn from our history and to appreciate the enormity of what it is when somebody says, I believe in the values that my country stands for enough that I'm willing to put my life on the line when you ask me to. Soldiers don't get to decide what they fight in, as much as Danielle Smith seems to believe that soldiers are able to just do whatever the hell they want in a battlefield. It's simply not true. They don't get to choose the conflicts. They make the commitment that when the people who are in positions of power say, yeah, this one matters, we're really sorry that we have to ask you to do this, but we need to ask you to do this. That it's going to be for the right reasons and not bullshit reasons. Danielle Smith clearly doesn't have even the vaguest appreciation of the enormity of that. She clearly doesn't have the vaguest respect for the enormity of that, because for her, like all things Danielle Smith, it's about her. When we talk about the kind of values that Canada aspires to, and it's so important to understand, we aspire to them. You don't get to say, I don't get to say, that Canada served in World War II because we believed in freedom. We don't get to say Canada served in World War II because we believed in equality for everyone. Because when First Nations individuals who served in World War II came back, they had their status revoked. Residential schools were mandatory in this country until 1969. First Nations people didn't even get the ability to vote in federal elections until 1960. This is our history. The romanticizing of military conflicts, the oversimplification of military conflicts sets us back. And here's the person who's the Premier of Alberta leaning into all of that. You want to talk about Canadian values. Canadian values are service, their community, their pursuit of making things better, openness, respect, compassion, willingness to work hard and to be there for each other, to search for equality and justice. At its core, Canada is about trying to put our society first. And that's exactly what we did during the pandemic. It is so important that we put society first, that it's actually part of our Constitution. It's part of our charter. It's the first section of the charter. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in its subject only to such justifiable limits prescribed by law as can be reasonably demonstrated in a free and democratic society. Who gets to decide that? Well, there's actually a test. It's called the Oakes test. And the Oakes test determines whether or not setting aside charter rights for a period of time is justified. There's two fundamental criteria. The goal has to be both pressing and substantial, and then there has to be a proportional analysis that's done using three subtests. The first one is the provision of the law which limits a charter right is rationally connected to the law's purpose. If it is arbitrary and serves no logical purpose, it doesn't pass the test. A provision must minimally impair the violated charter right. So saying to people, for this period of time, we need to limit whether or not you can go to these places is only valid as long as it's reasonable. Easy example of this would be the Coots protest. It was never against the rules for people to protest. What was against the rules was blocking the border. Finally, the court examines the law proportionate effects. Even if the government can satisfy the above steps, the effect of the provision on charter rights may be too high a price to pay for the advantage the provision would provide in advancing the law's purpose. In order to get around the charter, the requirements are incredibly high. They're complex, and they're decided by courts of law. They're not decided by angry small town city councilors who decide that they're going to spark all kind of conjecture about mass conspiracies to light the province on fire. They're not decided by pastors, alleged pastors, people who call themselves pastors, because it puts them in a position of power and authority, and arguably in a position to make a lot of money. And they sure as shit aren't decided by has-been radio hosts who are willing to prey on people, prey on their fears, pander to the worst parts of humanity, disrespect the people who have said, this society matters enough for us that we're going to say that when you call, we'll answer. We'll go do the very bad things so that you don't have to. We'll go see the very bad things so that you don't have to. We will have the very bad things happen to us, happen to our friends, happen to our loved ones so that you don't have to. Remembrance Day is not about you, Danny. And the fact that you can't see that at any point it is beneath everything. And for anyone who has any doubts as to whether or not what I just said is valid, and as to whether or not Danielle Smith is willing to use and exploit the people that she does, which are, unfortunately, predominantly rural Alberta, which is where I come from. One need only listen to how little she thinks of rural Alberta.
Problem with the UCP is that they have a rural base, and in rural Alberta, they are a lot slower to move on social issues. There is a lot stronger religious conservatism in rural Alberta. There may not be as many openly gay members of the community, and so people don't have as much of a familiarity as they would in Calgary or Edmonton. And as a result, this is one of the things that's kind of baked into a party that has a lot of rural support, is that there will be candidates who express these extreme views. I am hoping at some point conservatism comes around to embracing gay conservatives as well. I mean, 20 years ago, the big sin that they were talking about was divorce. And so perhaps 20 years from now, we'll be talking about something else, and they'll be able to have a much bigger tent. Well,
that's how little Danielle Smith thinks of rural Alberta. And if you don't think for 1 second that she's just playing you, you have grossly underestimated who it is that you're dealing with. Couple of quick little things that we want to make sure that we mention before we open it up for the town hall. One of them is we have an announcement for a debate. Allegedly, the debate between Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley, which is, oh boy, I do hope that Danielle Smith shows up. I really, 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 really do, because that's a debate that I want to see. We'll do an after the debate thing. On the Twitter Spaces and on here probably, because there's no doubts that if Danielle Smith actually does have the temerity to show up, it's going to be quite the display. Because as Mr. Thomas Lukasik said on an episode just a little while ago, Danielle Smith is a lot of things, but a fast thinker on her feet, she's not. Really, really good reading the news, but when it comes to actually synthesizing critical ideas on the fly, not her strong suit. So watching her go up against Rachel Notley when Rachel Notley doesn't have a script in front of her, I'm looking forward to seeing that. So that's going to be on May 18th, and apparently it's Global that's going to be carrying it. One other little thing that I want to say before we open it up to the floor, I can see we already have one speaker on the Twitter Spaces who's looking forward to weighing in. I look forward to hearing what I got wrong. I'm sure there's lots. Holy hell with the trolls, you guys. we have, especially on Twitter, there has been this influx of bot accounts and trolls that have been coming by and saying and posting some really, really offensive stuff. To be clear, we're all for open discussion. We have no problems with that. That's one of the things that we love. That's why we're going to turn it over to our open mic in just a minute here. That being said, hate speech, not cool. And the breakdown doesn't have a date of birth on Twitter because it's not a person, it's a podcast. So there's a lot that gets filtered out on our end, but we have been hearing about it. And some of it we do see. Some of the hate speech definitely makes it through. Our ask to our audience is if you see people posting offensive, hateful things, please, 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 please report it. The traffic that has been going on the breakdown over the last little while, especially on the Twitter machine, has been, I'm going to use the word unprecedented because all the kids are these days. And it is almost impossible for us to keep up with on our own. So if you see things that are straight up racist or straight up misogynist, if you see inappropriate, let's go with adult content, please, please, please report it. Because we don't, we've been told it's a tactic that is used. Somebody's paying to have us attacked by a bot farm, apparently, which is absolutely mind blowing to me, because we're not that important. But if you see any of these posts, please report them because we don't have the ability to just delete them on the Twitter machine. So that would be a really big, huge help. And with that being said, that's the end of our official program. We're going to open it up to the room now, and it looks like we have Cassandra in first. So I'm going to vamp for 2 seconds while we wait for Cassandra to connect and unmute herself, and then hopefully we'll hear from her. Cassandra, it looks like if you've unmuted, what's going on tonight?
Well, I missed the first half of the show because I was talking to my mom on the phone, but where I did weigh in was about Danielle Smith's, lame excuses about COVID and her poppy dismay. And I really think that you hit it on the nose. I've been thinking a lot about Canada and the wars we fought and what World War I and World War II were about today because of some news on a federal level that kind of got me reeling because I thought it was just so dumb, but I won't talk about that, but I think, I like to think of myself as a studier of history. Like my biological grandfather was conscripted by the Weimar Republic into the army for World War One. Conscription, most people think of it these days, they probably think of the draft. Well, the draft is just conscription. Conscription means that, so a lot of people in both World War I and World War II in Canada volunteered. My father or my stepfather, who I call my dad, he volunteered. And he fought, he was a WW2 veteran. But many, many people that did not volunteer were conscripted, which means it was not their choice. They did not volunteer and sign up. They were conscripted because we needed bodies. There just wasn't enough volunteers. There was a big war to fight, and they were conscripted. It didn't mean that they were any less dedicated.
Oh, for sure not.
They knew what they were fighting for. But, that's another thing when we think of the poppy and we remember is that, many didn't have a choice. They were conscripted and they were sent off to war to fight a war. And like you do really horrific, horrible things that they might not otherwise in their normal lives have done. one of the things, like my dad, he had post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, I remember growing up, he was a pacifist. He was not a violent man. But it, like, you could be he could be on the top floor of the building fast asleep, and you could be on the second floor, and you could drop a pin and he would wake up because he was still sleeping all those years later. I mean, this is in the 80s. He was still had that carried that trauma with him where he just could never fully go to sleep. And, you know, one of the outcomes of that is he became a prolific anti-war activist. I grew up like if he was a prolific anti-war activist because of the things that he saw and did and was forced to do. Like he could not watch a movie with any violence in it. And there was this one movie, everybody's seen Cold Mountain. There's this one scene, it's less than a minute long at the very beginning of the film, and it's the only prolific violence in the entire film. And it's a really good film. But because that first less than a minute had that horrific war scene, he walked out of the theater and you could not get him to watch that movie because that's how traumatized he was. And so when he had friends die, you know, he lost people, he's seen people horrifically maimed. He saved people. And that poppy was there to remember the sacrifice that all of those people made with their lives and their limbs, and even for the sacrifice that he made, witnessing that. And, you know, when I hear some of the commentary, whether it's Danielle Smith making her disrespectful, ridiculous statements about the poppy, or comparing people to Nazis, or it's people making hay over whether we have Vimy Ridge on our bloody passports or not. It's just, it diminishes these things when we make these kinds of arguments and the basis of what they're made, it diminishes the sacrifice that those people made.
I couldn't agree more. It is, again, it for me, it keeps coming back to that expression, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And it is terrifying to me that, and again, I have no firsthand experience with war. So I only have the books on my shelves and the stories that I've heard from veterans of multiple wars.
Yeah. Well, even my brother, my oldest brother, he was in the army and an officer, and he's been in, he was in Kosovo and places like that. And he's got PTSD from it. Like, you can see how it's affected him. And I haven't been to war myself. I've had a life that I've seen some pretty horrific things, that some of them things that happen in war that don't always happen in war. But it's, I'm actually quite tired of people talking like they know. And, my dad, he knew, like, many years ago, when the Reform Party was on the rise and they merged with the Conservatives and all of that, I remember what he had to say about that then. I mean, he passed away in 2006, but I still remember, like, he saw the writing on the wall, which is a big reason why I speak up. And that quote from, it was George Santianas, I believe. Those who, I mean, later it was Churchill at the end of the Second World War quoted him. And, but, you know, those that forget history, I mean, that's why my dad would tell the story. I mean, he still didn't tell there's a lot he didn't tell, but he was very acute on when he saw something that was happening, and when he saw the writing on the wall of you know, talking about history and how those things came to be and why we have to remember history. And it's another reason why I pound so hard on the fact of, when we're talking about the Second World War, we like to think about, people want to think about the Holocaust. Well, we can remember the Holocaust, but if we don't remember the things that led to us getting there, then we're doomed anyway. Right? Because it's, you know, there's a path, there's choices that people make. And it's not one choice. Somebody makes a choice, people choose to ignore it or say it, oh, it's just one time. And then they make another choice and they go, and people ignore that. And every time somebody makes that choice and we as a society ignore that choice, we're a step farther along on that path to repeating some of the worst parts of history. I hope that we're better than that now, but when I hear these things, that is what scares me as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. And it's, to me, the thing that I find most upsetting, I guess I'll say, I'm not going to use any names, but I had a really good friend who served in a couple of different theaters, and I got to work with him professionally. That's how I met him, and he had so many things that he had to navigate, and the sacrifices that he made. You know, this idea that the battlefield can be romanticized and glory and all of this bullshit. You try to talk to any veteran who's seen any, I don't want to use the word real, but substantive action, air quotes, and they will not, most of them will not talk about their battlefield experiences because it hurts too much. There's of course some that will use the dark humor, but if you want to have a conversation, like, it's getting veterans to talk about the reality of it is incredibly hard for them. And
no,
to make
no,
to make it down to just, like, you know, as Miss Smith has done on multiple occasions, you know, freedom, principles, glory, blah. It is so, to me, ignorant, willfully so, and disrespectful, that I just can't even with it anymore.
No, I'm with you, and it, you know, I wish it was just Danielle Smith, because you know, sadly, it seems to be a theme. And you know, mine was the generation that didn't have to go to war until, you know, like, I remember our first precipice was really of anything close to what my parents' generation had to go through was probably the desert storm. I mean, there was other little things that happened, little wars here and there, but that was probably the thing that brought us to the precipice of where we are today. But the tragedy of the fact that there was literally a generation of people that did not have to experience a huge, massive war is that they only see the glory and they do not see the reality of the tragedy war is like you said, it is nothing to be glorified. It's nothing. Is there a fight? I mean, right now in Ukraine, they are literally fighting for the freedom of themselves and Europe and in the hopes of not just saving themselves, but with the reality on their shoulders that if for any reason they lose, it could spread, and then we would be in another war. And so to hear when we're on that edge right now, right today as we speak, we're sitting on that edge of repeating the history of another world war, which with much and every time we've had a world war, it has been that was the worst war. It was even worse than the last. And if you think of the technologies and things that we have come up with now to mutilate each other, the fact that we are sitting on the precipice of this with Ukraine, and there's people like Danielle Smith and others that want to diminish and glorify and talk about something they just have no idea about. Like
Yeah. To me, it
I
boils
haven't.
down to the fact that a veteran who is very dear to me told me once that war is the result of a failure of every other institution.
Yep.
And when you take a look at who we are choosing to run those institutions, Danielle Smith's not going to be the person who decides whether or not we go to war. Thank God. But
Yep.
when we lower the standard by allowing hacks like these people to get into public office, that has a ripple effect that extends all the way through all other forms of elected office. And that puts those institutions that are supposed to protect us from things like war, lest we forget. That's
Yep.
where it gets really scary for me.
Yeah. No, 100. Nailed it. Nailed it, Nate.
Thank you. Anything else you want to add into the mix, Cassandra? I got a couple other people who have tagged in here.
No,
So
that's my speech for the day. That's my TED talk.
awesome. Thank you so much. It was way better than any of the TED Talks that we've ever seen from Danielle Smith.
Not a very high bar, but
Well, I didn't mean it that way.
I'll take it as a compliment.
That's how it was intended. So I'll take
I know.
I'll take the laugh on that one. Thank you so much, Cassandra.
Thanks.
We've got Sam who's raised his hand next, and then we're going to get to Michelle. Sam, if you're there, go ahead, unmute your microphone. And if you're not there, then I'll go ahead and oh, there we go.
Hey, Nate, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. What's going on, man?
First off, I just want to say, starting off, I've never been an enlisted member of the military, but I'm not willing to get into too much detail on what I do in my professional life. But I work in the defense contracting industry, which obviously serves the military and has a lot of veterans and people that are directly with the military, work with them every day. And I just want to reiterate pretty much everything you've said. I've heard around my place of work this week, and it was extremely insulting to those members. So I just want to thank you for, kind of summing that up and say that, the feeling among people that have served and are currently serving, those feelings are definitely there and real. And I just want to also mention, the most ironic part about all of this is this was the week that we had a state of emergency in Alberta, and the military has now been called in to assist. So after these comments, now the military is coming in. And I also just want to express frustration in the sense that declaring an emergency took so long to do. I'm not involved with the rotary wing portion of the military, but a big thing about the military, and a lot of people don't recognize because my background is aviation, is obviously military helicopters can fly at night, right? So when most helicopters, they can't fly at night, I think there's only one that's currently operating under a special program that can fight fires at night. But I think a real big capability that the military can provide, especially in an emergency evacuation situation, is they can fly in helicopters and they can evacuate. The instance I think of was, I forget the name of that First Nations reserve, but there was an area where they were surrounded, where I believe it was at least 2 sides, could have even been 3 sides of fire. And you can imagine how terrifying that would be. And, just want to, obviously I'm not involved, but I just want to say, like, in Fort McMurray, I believe the rotary wing and the military was called in a lot faster. And what they are able to provide is obviously night flying. They're able to provide intelligence, reconnaissance, and also just life-saving, abilities. And I just think it's just the timing of all this is just really insulting. And it's just really ironic. So sorry about my dog barking.
No, I have a weakness for dogs, so that's all good. No, I appreciate it. And I'm glad that you clarified the rotary wing to helicopter thing, because I'm rotary wing is a term that I'm familiar with in my line of professional work, but I know for a lot of people, the first time I heard rotary wing, I was like, how does that work? What are we talking about here? So, but I think you're absolutely right. And I want to be clear, when I was speaking earlier, I wasn't trying to. The military is very, very good at a lot of things. They're very, very good at logistics. If you point them at a thing and say, go do that thing, they'll get that thing done. I just don't think that managing a health emergency is their sandbox.
Well, no, it's completely different, right? And, like I said, I work in the defense contracting community, so I'm adjacent to the military. I'm not an enlisted member. But, it's just pure ignorance, right? Everybody fetishizes or fantasizes about the military and how it actually works. But, once you're involved and you understand some of the processes, it's a totally different machine, right? And, totally. I think for me, especially, all week on Twitter and stuff, I was just really pissed off that, for example, like in Edmonton, right? Like you guys have, there's the Army Aviation Unit, which they fly Griffin helicopters. And they could have deployed, like, I'm not exactly sure, but, they could have deployed probably relatively fast, to assist in whatever, right? And just to have that there. And I think I'm just, and to think of all the recent natural disasters that we've had in Canada, as far as I can tell, the military has been called in relatively quickly, and especially helicopter assets and troops, and just to aid where they can. And, I just think it's incredibly insane that Danielle Smith waited so long, and then she, told her members. And, the other thing that comes to my head too is, just the comments that she's made about Russia, right, with Ukraine, and not really walking that back as far as I can tell. So,
well, even we saw the UCP candidate for Livingstone MacLeod. I'm really trying hard on my pronunciation because I get in trouble every time I spell it or mispronounce it wrong. But her husband was putting up pro-Putin, pro-Russia. I'm going to call it propaganda on the Facebook machine up until the great social media purge and the blanket 15-year apology. I still can't get over that. Like, sorry for the last 15 years. Can't hold it against me no more. But there is it seems to be that there is a culture that exists within the UCP where this sort of stuff is just allowed, and it's insane to me.
Yeah, completely. And I think, another big thing for people to understand too is, like, the military, they don't provide actual aerial firefighting services. So the helicopters, they can't pick up and drop water. That's just not within their capabilities. But the life-saving support and the ability to transport people and do those secondary things that, when helicopters are working on fires, they're doing first line things. They're dropping water, they're bringing people in and out, right? They're not there to do those secondary support roles because they just don't have the assets to do that. Helicopters are incredibly expensive, right? So, I think that it's just insane that they waited so long, and it just speaks to, in my opinion, incompetence. So that's kind of all I wanted to say. But
well, thanks, man. I appreciate you tagging in tonight.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Sam. You have a good night. And I'm going to bring in, I think it's Michelle. And then I see we also have Tammy in the mix as well. So, Michelle, if you're there and you haven't drifted away from your phone.
Hello.
How's it going?
Can you hear me? I'm great. How are you?
I'm a little fired up tonight, but other than
Yeah.
that, I'm doing okay.
Me too. So I'm just I have two comments to say, and it's like, long time listener, first time caller kind of thing. But on behalf of the fellow first frontline healthcare workers, I think just even your emotion and how you were describing it before just kind of hit me. I myself, just for I know transparency, I'm a neonatal transport nurse, so I go out and pick up newborns in distress. And I think Danielle Smith's comments today just not only speak to like disrespect to the military, but to everybody on the front line. Like there's a lot of stuff that we've seen that we just can't talk about to our families. And it's just that lack of knowledge, lack of respect, lack of giving a crap about real things that real people are going through. And even like as far as military goes, like even just the victims, like it doesn't even have to be our military. Like lest we forget also is lest we forget the people on the other side that didn't come home either.
Yep.
Nobody asked to be in that place, and people signed up and did that for our freedom the same way. I mean, you as a paramedic, like you go into some things that are rough, and we make these choices so other people don't have to. And it just speaks to, she doesn't care who she hurt. She doesn't care about the people of Alberta in any way, about the people that are evacuated from their homes, about all of these things. And it's hurtful. It's a slap in the face again from the people that are supposed to be protecting us. And yeah, I really felt it deep today, Nate.
No,
So
no.
I
just want to say, for what it's worth, you do one of the jobs that I'm most afraid of. Like my partners,
we hear this from paramedics.
oh
a
yeah,
lot.
no, my partners know, like when I'm not working solo and when I'm working on the ambulance, the people who have worked with me for any length of time know that if it's called a 24 card for labor and delivery. But when a 24, especially a 24 Delta comes in, everybody knows I'll be professional and I'll deal with whatever's in front of me when I get there, but I'm swearing the whole way there.
I feel the same way about adults.
Well, there we go.
So, it's mutual respect.
Yeah,
But
no,
it's just that whole thing. Like, I mean, you face this stuff and it's hard, and like to just discount what the sacrifices people have made, even just surviving, like that survivor's guilt of coming home when your whole friends and family like didn't. Like, how do we forget that? That's insane to me that you can just be so flippant on those comments and just, like it's just an everyday conversation. It's crazy.
Yeah. No, even like I think about to extend the metaphor a little bit. I think about the couple of times that I've walked into a NICU and I've seen the things that go on. I mean, the little furry ones are just so cute.
Yeah.
But the first time I was introduced to a word, and anybody who hears this word, if you want to look it up, do so at your own peril. But the first time that I was introduced to the word gastroschisis, I was nope, I'm out.
Yeah. Well, you should see on the other side when you actually hold those body parts in your hand. Yeah.
Yep.
I took my kids for a tour once, and there was a couple babies, and that was a conversation I wasn't expecting.
Yeah.
So, but we all do tough things. Any of these police officers, like how many police officer deaths have we had? And it just shames the whole thing. Like it doesn't change my passion for wanting to do it, but man, it's just disheartening that the people above are even having these conversations and being allowed to. It's crazy. Like
the thing that gets me the most is the bullshit apologies. I'm sorry if my words offended somebody. Like, you're sorry that you said the dumb thing.
Yeah.
If you can't say that, then I don't want to hear it.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the thing. Like, why bother apologizing? Like, you don't mean it. It's obvious you don't mean it. Like, don't even bother. Just roll with a double down at this point. Like, why bother? It's worse. Like, it's worse that you're apologizing.
Tomorrow's a new day. She's got lots of time.
It's true. Apparently, there's rumblings that there's trouble behind the curtain there too. I don't know.
That's
Maybe
been going
some
on for a
mutiny in the
while.
UCP. Yeah, I don't know.
That's been. I mean, that was part of our conversation with Mr. Lukasik. Is that, and he, I posed the question to him, hey, so Take Back Alberta, if they get like 6 MLAs, can they set the course of the government? Or is
Yeah,
there like some sort of
exactly.
magical mechanism? And he was like, no, we're just screwed.
Yeah, that was terrifying. I was like, oh my God.
That's not what I
Like,
wanted to
need
hear at
move.
all.
Yeah, I was like, I don't want to move. I like it here.
Well, it's true though.
Yeah.
This is my born and raised here. This is my
Yeah.
home, and
Yeah.
I love this province, and I don't want to see it get dragged through the mud by people
Well.
who can't even have respect for our veterans.
Well, this is it. But yeah. Either way though, I appreciate your candor, and
Oh, thank you.
just I felt it, and it's, yeah, there's no words.
That's why I ran out of some, I think, at the end there.
Yeah, 100%.
All right.
And hopefully we're not delivering babies on the highway, and we'll be good.
Don't even, like you say, you work in healthcare, you don't say
I
these things
know,
out loud.
I know. I didn't say the Q word. So
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for
Yes,
weighing in
thank you.
tonight.
No problem, Nate. I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you very much. All right. I'm going to bring in longtime caller, Tammy.
Hello, it's
Hey,
me
how's it
again.
going?
Oh, not too bad.
Good.
So I'm gonna take a step away from the stuff that you've been speaking about, even though it's really important. It's
No, by all
still
means.
associated, but so I'm not certain anyone is reaching some of the folk, and they're not even extremists, but some of the conservatives that just will not believe that the UCP is an issue, that they're not conservatives the way the progressive conservatives were.
Yeah.
So my eldest daughter's the other side, my ex's family. So my daughter has turned out way like me, and she's like, no, I'm voting NDP this time. I'm voting NDP. Even though she knows that where she lives in Camrose, she says it's basically a protest vote. I know that the NDP aren't gonna take anything in Camrose. But when all the horrible things that Danielle Smith says, and all the horrible things that the rest of their party says, they just hurt her grandparents. They just won't step away from that well, like she's literally said, Grandma, have you not heard the things they've said? Well, her grandmother's attitude is, well, we just have to hope that they'll control Smiths. Who's going to control Smith? Which one of them is going to control Smith? None of them are willing to.
They've been doing a great job so far.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, come on, wake up and smell the hummus. Like, please.
Yeah.
And then there's this young fella, and I love him to death. He's smart, but he's a neurodivergent fella, but he's so indoctrinated with this. The NDP did this horrible thing. They didn't take good care of oh, sorry, my stroke is taking away the word. Where the last big fires were.
Oh,
and I apologize to everyone.
Fort McMurray.
Thank you. They didn't take care of Fort McMurray. I'm like, where the hell's that coming from? Like, look at it seriously. She did a good job. She did a much better job than Danielle Smith is with the fires right now.
Yeah, my beef with the NDP for Fort McMurray has nothing to do with the logistics or anything. And I say this is, I hate playing this card, but as somebody who was there for the response, I didn't see, from my experience, a shortage of the things that were needed. It was a tremendous, huge thing that got out of control super, super fast, and it took a little while to rein it back in. But from what I saw in the capacity that I was there, there were resources that were available and doing the things. And that, to me, it's my beef, and I've said it before on the show. My beef was the flippancy with which she treated it, and that, I think that was a learning experience. I hope that was a learning
I hope.
experience.
I would hope so too.
Yeah.
You know, I get that, and yeah, I hope that she learned something about that flippant sort of comment. I remember what that was about. But there's equal flippancy. I mean, you can't. I'm not going to minimize what Notley said, which was inappropriate.
Well, see, the difference is, if I can jump in for a quick sec, to me, the fundamental difference is, I look at what Notley said, and believe you me, I get the dark humor. I use the dark humor all the time in my line of work, as do many other people in my line of work, because it's a critically important coping mechanism. The trick is knowing your audience and when you can and can't use the dark humor. But I can look at what Rachel Notley said and go, oh, that was not appropriate. But it is not reflective to me. To me, it was a awkward comment at an overwhelming moment, and I would have liked to see more leadership in that moment. It wasn't there. It is what it is. But there is a world of difference for me between landing a bad joke that's clearly a bad joke and all of the other things that we have going on from the current Premier of Alberta. There's a difference between a failure to read the room and a failure of character.
Exactly. I agree 100%. And I don't think that the completely indoctrinated, which are, like I said, the elderly, and this young fella, and he's smart. Like, I've started trying. I won't call it re-educating him, but I've asked him, like, use your critical thinking skills with some of these things that you're believing that these people are saying to you, and just think about it, like, think it through. And the problem is that when you ask these folks sometimes to think it through, they hit that, but they've got to be wrong. They got to be wrong. We're missing something. We're got to be wrong. And it's like, no, I'm asking you, I'm telling you, you are smart enough to see through this. Like, I'm not saying you're dumb. You're not. I know you're smart enough to see through this. But they just won't.
It's hard when it's so tied up in identity, I think, is part of the problem. And I don't think that I think part of the challenge of the conversations that we have, and this is why, when we have had people call into the show who are coming from a bent different than my own, I welcome those conversations, as long as it's not, hate speech or any of those things, because I think that, there's a reason I end the show the way that I do. We have to get better at having conversations with each other, because when we're talking about issues of identity, and I've seen the same thing that you're talking about, I've absolutely seen it, where you'll have a conversation with somebody who is entirely capable from a objective standpoint of understanding the information, but because it's tied up with identity, to reject that information causes them to experience a form of dissonance that makes them feel like they're having to reject their own identity.
Yeah.
That's why people get so upset when the Flames lose every year. Because I'm not a Flames fan. I don't do the sports at all. But when people are I'm a Flames fan, or I'm an Oilers fan, or whatever. When they have that going on and a bad thing happens to their little group, then they go, oh. I mean, take a look at the Vancouver riots.
Yeah.
That's a perfect
Yeah.
example of a temper tantrum
Yeah.
that got way out of control.
Yeah. And sometimes I just wonder, I don't think I have the temperament for, I mean, this one fella, I'm willing to go the extra mile because he's from our area and he's been really good. And it just is so confusing because everything else about him should say that he's not, that he should be like an NDPer and would get these things, like everything else about him. But he's coming from the area where I grew up. And that area, even though it's not that far out of Edmonton, is so strongly tied in to that conservative bullcrap. Like I couldn't put before our family farm burnt down, I could not put an NDP sign up, even though my family had always voted either NDP or Liberal when the Liberals still existed in Alberta. Every time, like but you couldn't advertise that because everybody around you was conservative of some stripe, and you'd basically like in the election after Notley won the one time, the last one, I literally feared for saying, well, I'm voting NDP, because there were people there that were literally like threatening and they can't get in again. It was like literally scary. I'm listening to these people and I'm like these are my neighbors. And I don't think I trust any of them because they're that
To me, it's fear. They're afraid. And that's where I think, one of the things that we've talked about on the show repeatedly, and it's good to see that they're starting to make some headway in, the way that I've said it is they got to learn how to speak Calgarian. But it's good to see that the NDP are starting to make some headway in regards to speaking Calgarian, but they've got a long way to go in regards to speaking rural Alberta and understanding the culture of rural Alberta. And ingraining that in their own identity, because I think that people want to see themselves in the things, and it's just, I mean, you have a rural background as well, so you know what I'm talking about. But it's a whole different dynamic and thing, and all of the things.
Yep, and I was the weird kid, right? I was the kid that never fit in with anybody else, so it would make sense that I ended up NDP. But I was also raised by parents that were NDP and hated conservatives, and so I mean, I guess, and they never pushed it on me. In fact, my mom was like, go out and do all the things, meet all the people, talk to everyone, even if it was just a way to keep me the hell out of her house. But she never pushed anything, so she let me kind of look and explore and develop my own thoughts. And in the end, because of that, because I was kind of this well-rounded kid that liked science and liked computers and was learning all the things, when it came to that kind of indoctrinated attitude, I just never fit in that mold because it just wasn't me. So I didn't work in their clutches. I didn't fit within their ideas. So for me, I was always the outsider. So of course I ended up outsider all the time, even out there. And it was interesting because I could see where they would, they'd be doing this thing. And I'm like, but isn't it against your own best interest, the things that you are doing or the things that you are supporting? Like, do you not see that? And they don't. They literally don't. And I think sometimes the powers that be, and in Alberta, that tends to be the Conservatives, they depend on that. They depend on them not seeing that the people that they're voting for, it literally is leopards eating people's faces.
Yeah.
The leopards eating people's faces party.
Well, I think that there's also and I think that we see this particularly with Ms. Smith. I think that there's a couple of different gerbils running around in there, and I think one of them is saying, "Hey, I really didn't like the pandemic, and I was really upset." And I think that there's a component of her that absolutely buys into the conspiracy theory bullshit. But at the same time, I think that, as we saw from that clip that we played when we rounded out the official program, Danielle Smith knows very well what rural Alberta is about. She knows very well how to
play them.
Yes. And you know what's interesting? We just did an interview for an episode that we're going to be dropping in a little bit with somebody who worked with Danielle Smith in the Wild Rose Party, and they confirmed exactly that. So it's I think that part of the problem is that there are some people in the world, like Danielle Smith potentially, who are entirely comfortable lying to people's faces if it gets them what they want. And I think that's the thing that we have to have a much bigger conversation about. I hope that clip that it came from the MD War Room, which is also another Twitter account that everybody should follow because they're awesome. But it came from them. But I think that it shows very clearly that how little Danielle Smith thinks of rural Alberta and how happy she is to just play them.
Yep. I will definitely watch. I pay my $5 a month, so I will watch it.
It'll be it's going to be the next one. I'm going to use this opportunity to do a little bit of actually I'm going to ask anything else you wanted to throw into the mix, and then I'll do the plugs.
I'm going to say one more thing, and it's kind of off on the side, but Leela here, she said something, and it's like, okay, like we get that you're trying, like she spoke out about I believe it was the Nazi bit.
Did she? Good for her.
But she didn't do it in a specific way. She just kind of said, well, she just, how to explain it? She didn't specifically speak out about that, but she basically spoke out about the wars and everything else. So what I said to her, or sent her a tweet, and of course she didn't respond, but I sent her a tweet that if she was really a principled conservative, I said, I'll never vote for you because that's never going to happen in any kind of way, shape, or form if you end up back in politics. But you need to take a page out of another principled conservative who I will never vote for either, which is Liz Cheney. And I said, what they're doing is wrong. If you were really a principled conservative, you're not in their clutches anymore. Why can't you speak out? But she's not. She's gone silent. So I have a hard time feeling that a person's really a principled conservative if they're not going to step up. Like Cheney, I'd never vote for her. I'd never support her. But damn it, when the ships were down, she did what was right.
And I think that those people do exist. Like I keep going back to, who is it who ran against Obama? He had the terrible, terrible running mate.
The old fella.
Yeah, I can't remember his name. I'm tired.
I can't think of his name either, and it's right on the tip of my tongue. But of course, like I said, I've had a couple of strokes, so sometimes words don't come quickly.
Much better reasons than I do. But I will never forget when he was doing his town hall, and somebody asked him a question about Obama. being all of the bullshit conspiracy theory things. And his response was, you know what, Mr. Obama and I disagree on a great many things, but that's not true. None of the things that you said are true. He's an American. He's a good man. We just have differing opinions on the direction the country should go forward. And I was just like, that's what we need.
That's what we need.
John
That's
McCain, thank you to
John
the
McCain,
comments.
thank you.
Oh, this is why I love our comment section. Thank you so much, Galaxy Hunter 309. I love the tang as well. Yeah, John McCain. You know, he drifted for a while, but when he came back, when he realized that he had a limited amount of time to play with, that dude was. See, I remember my first experience with John McCain because I used to love watching The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and he came on a couple times, and it was just like, man, this guy is there's something going on here. And then he went with Palin, and you could see that the wind just kind of sucked out of his sails for a while there. But then he came back, and when he post surgery stood, I want to say it was the Senate. And delivered the speech about the direction of the United States, and it was just like, man, that's what we need.
That's what we need. You know, like I've said before, I said, you know, back when it was the actual PCs, and I was a kid back then. But one of the things I always remember my mom saying is that even though they were conservatives and my mom didn't agree with the conservatives, she said we never worried about what they were going to do. There might have been pieces of it that we didn't like, but we didn't worry about them.
Yeah, totally hear you.
With the UCP now, we worry about what these people are going to do. So there is a vast difference between what the UCP are and what the progressive conservatives were. And that's it. Now I have nothing else to say. I vented my spleen, as a friend of mine would say. So have a great night.
Awesome. You have a great night as well. And with that, we're gonna wrap things up because we're getting close to Lord of the Rings length again. So I'm gonna throw a couple of plugs out into the ether. The first one that I'm gonna mention is we have a couple episodes that are coming up. One of them is it's a little bit interesting. I think everybody knows that this is a two-party election. I think that all of the polling certainly supports that. But nonetheless, we threw the invitation out a little while ago. If anybody who's running in the election wanted to have a conversation, and the Alberta Party did show up. So on Sunday, we're going to be dropping a conversation with, I want to say it's 6. I have it in front of me right now. But 6 Alberta Party candidates who are talking about what they would like to try to accomplish in this election. And it's an interesting little conversation. There's some moments in there that I think are quite good. So we're gonna be dropping that. That'll be this Sunday. And then we also just recorded a conversation today with the very passionate, very outspoken David Gray, who is an economist who specializes in energy and particularly electricity. And he talks about how it is that the electricity prices in Alberta have gotten to where they are. And spoiler alert, it's because of decisions that were made in government in the last couple of years. And we're all getting screwed. So David Gray he joins us to explain how. And we also talk about a couple other things because he was heavily involved with the Wild Rose at the same time as Danielle Smith and was there on the infamous day when Danielle Smith, after promising everybody there would be no more floor crossings, went ahead and crossed the floor herself. And he gives us a little bit of inside scoop, inside perspective on Danielle Smith and her motivations at that time. It's a very good conversation. So we're going to be dropping that one as well in the next little bit here. As always, we give first crack to all of the interviews to our Patreon supporters. If you are interested in having early access to all of our interview episodes and the warm, fuzzy feeling that comes from knowing that you're supporting a little endeavor that frustrates a great many politicians, and occasionally, apparently, finds clips of things that certain political parties then like to try to take credit for. If you like doing that sort of thing, then you can sign up to be one of our Patreon supporters at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. It's you can then tweet it like Danielle Smith and be like, hey, I'm supporting the breakdown, and then she'll probably block you if she hasn't already. But it's because of the support of our Patreon sponsors that we're able to produce the kind of content that we do. So as always, huge thank you out to them. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who weighed in on the Twitter Spaces tonight and shared their thoughts, because I love the conversation part. And the different perspectives are always delightful. And NICU intimidates the holy hell out of me. So knowing that there are brave people out there who will do the things that scare the crap out of me makes me feel a little bit safer in the world. If you're listening tonight and you're thinking to yourself, well, maybe next time I'll do the Twitter Spaces and I'll weigh in with some thoughts, would absolutely love it. Also want to say a huge thank you to all of the people in the comments section tonight. Y'all were busy tonight, and as always, I'm going to go back and read them all as soon as we're off the air here. But you saved me with the John McCain thing. A couple of you did, and I really do appreciate that. So big thank you to everybody who's been active in the comment section. All of that being said, going to say a good night to everybody. We're going to be back. Like I said, Sunday is going to be our panel discussion with the Alberta Party. We will be back next Wednesday for another live show. God help us. I'm sure there will be no shortage of things to talk about. Hopefully they don't make me quite as angry as this week's show did, because it's tiring. But in the meantime, and in between time, especially as I say it every episode, I'm going to say it again. The takeaway is find somebody who you can have a conversation with about everything that's going on with this provincial election. At least one person. If you can do that in the next week, that is how we move forward. Take breaks. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the conversation going.